Greetings, my name is Mike and welcome to this video on data binding in Android. Now this is something that has actually been around for a while, but I figured I might as well make a video on it because maybe not everyone knows about it. Now data binding is a library that allows us to bind UI components like text views to some kind of data source, meaning whenever the data source changes, the text views and the UI components magically update for us. And it also has something called two-way binding, which means we can update a UI component like an edit text, then it will magically update the underlying data source as well, which is pretty cool. And it basically also gets rid of a lot of boilerplate code that we have to deal with when updating views, which is pretty cool. Now, before we jump into the code, I must warn you that someone mentioned in the comments that it's a bit more readable if I have light theme on, so prepare your eyes for that. So I figured I might as well try it out and see if it actually does look a bit better. The code that you're about to see is all on my GitHub page, which is a link below to it, and I'll also put a link to the documentation. I do recommend checking it out because there is a lot of stuff there, and some of it I won't go through here because it's a bit more advanced, so just keep that in mind. Anyway, here's the layout we're going to be looking at. Basically, it looks like this on the right-hand side. You have some text views, an edit text, a button, and an image view. Nothing too crazy, and there's no underlying crazy logic or service calls or databases or anything that we're going to be dealing with. We're just going to mostly be looking at this file here. Now, before we go ahead and start using data binding, we need to set it up in the project. We do that by going to our build.gradle file, and in the Android block, we add another block called data binding, and then you say enabled true, like that. Pretty simple. And since I'm working in the library module here, you'll see on the left, I'm in the data binding module. This is just for my demo project. We also need to enable it for the app module, which is the thing that's going to be using the library module. Otherwise we get some runtime crashes, which just kind of sucks. So I'm going to add the same thing there in the app module's build.gradle file and go ahead and sync up the project. Alright, once that's done, just go ahead and close those Gradle files. We're done there. Now we jump to the layout file again, and if we Alt-Enter on the first line, we see Convert to Data Binding Layout pop up, which is a pretty nice IDE feature, so you can just press enter there and it will do some things for us here. The most important thing that you'll note here, it adds a data sort of segment for us, and it adds this new root tag called layout, which just signifies that this layout file is data binding layout. And of course the closing tag is also layout. The rest of the layout here is the same within that linear layout, but it just added this data block for us, which is where we'll be putting our various data elements like some variables and stuff like that. But we'll see now what I mean. Now, jumping back to the preview here, you'll see that it says welcome and then your name. Now, I want to update this your name placeholder to be data bound to some kind of user object and to the name field. So what I can do in this data block here is I can add something called a variable and then give it the name, say user. This is any name that you want. And in the type, I'm going to make it my user object that I've created. If it would stop lagging, that would be great. If I just go to that user object, you'll see what it looks like here. It's just got a name and an age, and you can have whatever other properties you want in there. So I've got now a variable called user of type user, and I can actually go ahead and use this variable in the code and bind the layout to some of the properties. So let's start off by going to our text view here, corresponding to your name on the right here. And I'm going to set the Android text property like you normally would, text. But instead here, where it gets a bit different, I'm going to say @ and then open, close curly brackets like that. That signifies that this field is now data bound pretty much. Inside here is where I'm going to bind it to the user object. So I can say user, which is the name of the variable up top, dot name. So I'm just referencing the user's name field. And then that's all we need to do. Now this text view's value will always be set to whatever this variable's value is, the name field. Now we can actually go and see that in the code. First, we kind of have to change how we set the content view in the activity. You don't just say set content view anymore. You have to say data binding util.set content view, import that, and then it needs a type argument here. Now this is the type argument of the generated binding class. So whenever you have a data binding layout like this, it will generate a new class for you behind the scenes, which name is activity create Pokemon binding. It's just the name of your layout file postfixed with binding. So I can say here activity create Pokemon binding, like that. That's a generated file that happens whenever we have a layout file that is for data binding. And then we need to add a first parameter, which is the current activity, which is this. Cool, now that is basically inflating our layout for us with data binding support enabled. Now what we can do is we can extract this into a variable, and you'll see that the type of the variable is activity create Pokemon binding. Now this generated binding class is how we can sort of interact with our layout file. So for example, you'll notice here when I say binding dot, it has a user property because we've added a user variable to the data binding class. So now we have a user property that we can interact with. I'm going to set my user to a new user whose name is Mike and age is 25. So you'll see when we run this now, the text view in the layout will be bound to Mike. So let's just give it a run and actually check that it does work. Here we go. Let's see. So I'm going to go to the data binding sample and look at that. Welcome Mike. Without us having to do any other weird stuff like find view by ID or something like that, we can just easily update our view by setting the user property on the binding object. Pretty cool, right? So that's basically the most simple use case there is for data binding. That's what we call one-way binding, where you are just updating the UI to match some data source. Yeah, I have a few things I want to talk about. This is what I'm going to be going through. So as you can see, we've done that one. So now I want to mention two-way binding quickly. This is what allows us to update the UI and then change the data source from that. So I've got an edit text here that I want to use two-way binding for. So basically, whenever I change the text on the edit text, then some data must change somewhere else. So to get started, I'm going to go and add a new variable though. I'm going to just say, I'm just going to call it something like my text, and its type is a char sequence because that's the type that the edit text works with, right? You set the text to some kind of char sequence. After that, I'm going to go in here, say Android text, if I can write properly. Again, we're going to have the data binding stuff here, and it's going to be my text. But for two-way binding, there's a little something extra you have to add, which is an equal sign after the @ symbol, which means this field is two-way bound. So now what's going to happen is whenever we type some text in the edit text, it's going to update this variable to have the current value of the edit text, which is pretty cool. Now, just to actually show that on the UI, I'm going to bind this text view, which is underneath the edit text. I'm going to set that thing's property, text property, to my text. And of course, it's only one way bound because it's just a text view. Let's run that and see that we can use two-way binding pretty easily. Here we go, data binding. So by default, we don't see any text because it's empty. And if I start typing hello world, look at that. Isn't that pretty sweet? Without having to do like any Kotlin or Java code at all, we can now two-way data bind and change the value of a text view without much effort at all. Pretty cool. Now you probably wouldn't have a use case like this too much or like really ever, but basically what you could do now is you could just read the value. If I go to my activity, I can say binding dot my text. Oops. So you could basically just get that value whenever the user like presses next or something, and you can get the current value of the edit text and then do whatever you need to with it. Pretty cool. Now the next thing I wanted to do is add a bit more logic other than just showing text. So I have over here an image view, the little Android icon, and I want to hide this image view just for whatever reason. I want to hide it when the edit text is empty. Now we can do that pretty easily here, right? You would normally do it by saying set visibility to view.visible or gone. But in here, we can do that all in the layout file, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to say Android, I can't type. So I'm going to say Android visibility. And again, since it's data binding, we're going to add our normal little symbols there. And we're going to set this to visible if the edit text is not empty, otherwise it's gone. So there's a nice little thing we can use. I'm sure if you've seen text utils around, it's part of the Android library. Is empty my text view dot, so if it's empty then it must be gone, else view dot visible. Right, pretty similar to something you would see in Java code, because this pretty much gets copy pasted into the generated binding class that I spoke about earlier. So you can basically write any kind of Java expressions in here and it will work without any issues. There are a few weirdnesses, so just do check out the documentation if you're interested. But You might think now that this will work fine, but let's see what happens when I try to build this code. It's going to give us some nice errors here. If I scroll up a little bit, you'll see it says cannot find identifier text utils. It's basically saying to us it doesn't know what we mean by text utils. We can resolve this by going up to our data section again and adding an import. Yes, that's right, you're importing stuff in your XML file, which sounds a bit weird, but hey, that's what you're going to do. And we're going to add the text utils import just like that. That's all you need to do. Similarly, I need to add one for view, because we're saying view.visible in the code, and it will also explode if we don't tell it what is view. Right over here. Now if we run this, hopefully it's gonna build without any issues. Yes, and it looks like it did. You never know with this stuff. Data binding. Look, the image is gone by default because the text is empty, right? So if I start typing, it shows up. Pretty cool. It makes me smile how easy this stuff is to do now and how little code you actually need to write. Cool, works pretty well. Just a word of warning though, and please listen to this. What you saw here is very powerful. It allows you to do a lot of stuff in these expressions, but you really shouldn't. You must try and keep it as simple as possible, because this kind of stuff can't be unit tested, which is very important to, obviously, to unit test your business logic. So try to avoid doing this kind of stuff in the XML files, because you can't test it and it becomes difficult to maintain as well. So just a word of warning, you want to keep this as simple as possible in here. Now on that note, I'm going to show you how you can simplify it a bit. You can add your own custom data binding properties to kind of get rid of this, right? I want to just bind it to a boolean here. I want to only put this in my expression here without the view stuff here. So we can create custom binding adapters, which sounds really fancy, but it's not. I'm just going to go to a new file here. And in Kotlin, you just write a top-level function, and in Java, you would have a static function in a class somewhere. But I'm going to write a new function that's like is visible, is what I'm going to call my property. And then that function will take in the first parameter is the type of views you wanted to work on. And since I don't really care, I can set any view to visible or gone or whatever. I'm just going to use the generic type or the super type view. And then afterwards, it's like, what type of data are you binding it to? I'm just going to set it to is visible, which is a boolean, right? I'm only taking the boolean, yes, it's visible or not. In here, you write the implementation for how do you do this? What is happening behind the scenes? So in here, it's literally just the same code we saw basically. Visibility, if is visible, view.visible, else view.gone. Right, that's pretty much almost what we saw previously. Now we just have it in here, and you can unit test this pretty easily. Finally, we need to add an annotation on here, binding adapter, which tells the library that, hey, this is something I want you to be able to use. And in here, we put the name of the property that we want, which typically you should keep it the same name as the method, but this is the important thing. This, you can put whatever you want. Now, just note that the generated class will call this method directly behind the scenes, so just something to keep in mind there. Now I can go back to my layout file and I can use that adapter that we just wrote. It'll be in the app namespace, and I called it is visible. Look at that, even auto completes for us. In here, we can pretty much just copy paste this text utils part, and I'm going to put a not in front, since it must be visible if it's not empty. And then I can get rid of this property below, and our life becomes a whole lot simpler now. Let's just verify that it still works, shall we? Because, yeah, you never know with coding. Here we go, installed, data binding, and look, it seems to be working fine without any issues. Now using our new binding adapter. So it basically means you can get rid of you can simplify a lot of the stuff you would have in here, and you can also unit test this logic. And as I mentioned, this code is called directly, so if I find usages of this method, you'll see it takes us to this lovely generated class, which you don't need to worry about, but you can actually see that it does get called directly. So keep that in mind. What else did I want to go over? Okay, so we're about halfway there. Sorry if it's going on a bit too long. But next, we're over halfway. I wanted to speak about handling events like click listeners, and this is also made pretty easy. So what I want to do is I want to handle this button's click and just show some toast message somewhere. So what we can do is, again, we add another variable that's like on button clicked, the name, and the type is a view dot on click listener. And sometimes it's a bit weird here, you might have to add the fully qualified name because I've imported view and it's a bit confused. So the type is on click listener, and then on our button we can just say on click listener, set it to the thing that we passed in. That's all we need to do in the layout file. We can go back to our activity and we can say binding dot set on button clicked listener, which is the name of the variable we just created up here. So we set that listener to a lambda in Kotlin, which is pretty nice, and I'm just going to say toast dot make text clicked short whatever dot show. That's all we need to do to handle on click listeners. So let's run it again just to make sure it works, but I'm 99% sure it will. Alrighty, data binding. Again, I can type some text, the image appears, and if I click me, you can see at the bottom it says clicked. Not very visible, sorry about that, but you can see the toast shows up there saying clicked. I just wanted to mention one more thing quickly. We could have actually not done this and not used a variable. We could put a lambda in here that says like toast.make text, pretty much the same stuff we put in an activity, we could put it here inside a lambda. But once again, this makes it very difficult to maintain and to look at, and even a bit tricky to test. So I would recommend not really putting lambdas in here, but just use the listener that we pass through as a variable, because it's much easier to read and understand. And you can easily just see in activity what's going on there. So yeah, just a note on that. Second last thing, I wanted to mention observable fields, which is very useful if you have a view model related to your activity, which you really should. So I've got a little blank view model here, and I want to create a field on it, which is now my name that I'm going to be binding to in the layout. And it's going to be a observable field, which is something that comes with the data binding library. And it's going to be a char sequence because that's the type of the field that we're using in the layout. And just like that, we can create a little observable field. Right? Now we can, in our view model, in our layout, sorry, we can take out our user variable. Well, I'm actually just going to change it to a view model. And I'm going to change the type to my view model as well. So now we're passing a view model reference in here. And then where I was using my user.name, I'm just going to say viewModel.name. You can bind directly to the observable field, right? Remember, this is not the user model anymore. It's an observable field, but you can still bind directly to that and it will work fine. Now this is cool because you can have some functions in here that's like whatever you might be doing in here. Whenever you need to update your UI, you just say name.set. And now you're updating that observable field at any time like this, and then it will automatically update on the UI side. Pretty nifty. So I'm just going to take out my model here. I don't think I need it anymore. I'm going to set my view model field on the binding to my view model that I've got in my activity. Let's just make sure that it actually works. I'm going to set it to a different thing here so you know. And let's go and run that. This is very useful here. Might not seem good in this case, and it's not really, but in the case where you have a service call coming back where it's fetching your user details, for example, you would have a name field here and whatever else you want to show on the UI. And you just update those fields when the service call comes back, and it happens pretty nicely. And no other logic in the activity is necessary. Okay, so it's finished installing, data binding, and it doesn't work because I didn't call that method. Let me just say viewModel.update. Okay, silly mistake there, as I'm sure we all used to that. Like forgetting to add the activity to the manifest and then it crashes. Okay, sorry, let's see that it does work now. Data binding, and then yes, there we go, it does say Mike J now. Yeah, so this is, again, a very powerful tool to use when you have data coming back not immediately as soon as you created the activity. Again, for a service call or something like that. The last thing I want to mention is something called automatic method selection, which sounds way more complex than it is. What it comes down to is when you are binding to properties here in your XML layout, it will try to automatically resolve setter names for you. So let me just show you an example, maybe it will make it a bit more clear. I've created this custom view here, which just extends text view, it's nothing too crazy, but I added a new method on it that's called setMyText. And it literally just sets the text, but with a prefix. So that's all you need to know. But now I haven't done anything else with adding custom attributes to this class. I just added a method. What you can do now is in your layout, you can say app myText equals, and then the data binding expression. This will try to automatically resolve a method called set this thing. So it'll try to look for a method called setMyText on this class, and it will call it with the value you pass through here. That's basically what it comes down to. I hope I explained that well enough. So I'm just going to bind it to the myText property, which means that whenever we type something in the text box, it's going to update this custom view as well, but with a prefix. So let's run it and just see that it works. Build finished and data binding. Cool, it starts off as null because there's nothing in here, but as I start typing, it's going to update the text view pretty nicely with that prefix. Again, if you go to the custom view and you search for usages of this method, remember we didn't call it directly anyway, but the generated binding class is calling it for us, so the resolving of that method did work correctly. This, you might find yourself using this surprisingly often. Basically, if you're working on a view that does not have an attribute directly made for it, you can still use any setters that that thing has, right? It looks for set and then that attribute name. So as long as there's a setter for something you need to use, you can data bind to it, which is pretty cool. But that's all I've got for this video. I know there was quite a lot to cover here, but I really think this is the most important stuff you need to know about data binding. Starting with the more basic things and going to slightly more advanced stuff, but I still think this is stuff that you really should know, because data binding does remove a lot of boilerplate code, and maybe you should test it out if you haven't given it a shot yet, because it does make life a lot easier. Yeah, that's all. So thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Looking forward to some comments on what you thought about this, and cheers for now.